Good evening. For this week's video discussion board, I chose to look at Chapter 4 of James Byrd's book, Sacred Scripture, Sacred War. In this chapter, he speaks to the popularity of David in colonial warfare. In particular, Byrd addresses the influence and nature of David in the context of the American Revolution through three main areas. These areas are the image of David as a warrior, the image of David as the psalmist, and David's legacy as king. These references are evident in sermons of the era, pamphlets such as those written by Thomas Paine, and in the belief held by many patriots of the influence of divine providence on the actions and outcome of the revolutionary cause. The first two are more easily adapted to the American cause for liberty, but the third proved more challenging. However, resourceful as they were during those days, the patriots found a way to make the experiences of David as king fit in a cause that was revolting against a monarch. The warrior theme is most aptly told using the story of David and Goliath. The Americans obviously are in the role of David, with the British being Goliath. Patriotic ministers like Jonathan Edwards used this in sermons to preach how David took the right approach to war by trusting in God, not might. David's defeat of Goliath also served as a reminder that all victories are by God's providence and outside the control of man. Byrd noted, quote, "Any soldiers, military officers, or even kings who attempt to wage war without God's blessing risk disaster on the battlefield," end quote. This is the sin that befell Goliath, pride, and ultimately contributed to the defeat of the British, as noted in several examples referenced by Byrd in his text. Byrd next discusses how the theme of the psalmist provided spiritual inspiration for wartime violence. As the author of the Psalms, David was praised by patriots for his ability to weave military heroism and spiritual devotion into his verse. A very popular verse was Psalm 144:1. "Blessed be the Lord my strength, which teacheth my hands to war and my fingers to fight." That was the name of this chapter in Byrd's book. American soldiers, Byrd said, quote, "were never more spiritually faithful than when engaged in armed combat for a righteous cause," end quote. The final theme discussed by Byrd is that of the monarch, the revolutionary fall of the House of David. Even though the Americans were rebelling to be free of a monarch, they looked to the scripture to see how an example of a good king like David could still lead to trouble. Thomas Paine argued that monarchy was unbiblical in his pamphlet Common Sense, but Byrd remarks how Paine did not refer in his pamphlet to David as a king, but as a man after God's own heart. In the end, though, as Byrd notes, David ultimately failed as a king, committing adultery and murder, providing yet more support to the American cause by proving that monarchy would corrupt even the best of men. Hannah Shell and Daniel Ott, in their book Christian Thought in America, speak to the growing fervor among Americans for independence being influenced by sermons, newspapers, and pamphlets of the period having these same religious tones. They argued the Great Awakening influenced many Americans with a greater sense of individual purpose and worth, providing a better and more positive view of God's work in the world, and in particular the New World. Philip Gorski, in his book American Covenant, speaks to the ideas that America was founded upon Christian principles and influenced heavily by divine inspiration. He uses a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville to emphasize his point. Quote, "The Americans combine the notions of liberty and of Christianity so intimately in their minds that it is impossible to make them conceive of the one without the other." Finally, Peter Lillback, in his excellent book, George Washington's Sacred Fire, speaks to the many examples of where Washington firmly believed in divine providence and spiritual inspiration as the path toward American liberty. Lillback points out how Washington often thought how historians would look back on the war and see the many American successes as fiction, for how else could they be explained other than by the hand of God himself, much like how David defeated Goliath. Thank you and have a great weekend.